and welcome to the last class for the 2022 SA National Scrapbook event. My name is Venetia Ramsey and I will be presenting class number 26 for the event. I'm going to work from a sketch that I've created. This is the basic idea of my thought process. Okay, so I've planned out my sketch, and because I'm wanting to make my own backgrounds, I've kind of filled in more or less what it is I want to do where. So we're going to try and stick to the sketch as close as possible. You'll see later on in the video I make a little mistake, and instead of attaching the 5x5 here, I swapped these two around, but I'll show you how I fix that. Right, so we are going to take that sketch and we are going to create a layout like this from that sketch. Okay, remember I said I messed up and swapped these two around. I fixed that by adding a little bit of extra stenciling in over here and putting the little sentiments. I put a sentiment in here, and then to balance it out I've added in extra over here. That's not in the video because I had to fix my mistake, but it was important for me for the photo to look like it's pulling over rather than stopping dead over here. It sort of looks like a dead spot there. So I fixed that by adding the little sentiment, making you look further, and then to balance it out, to create my visual triangle, I've added another sentiment there and there. Okay, for the ladies that are really not into mixed media, there is a link in the description to the video on how to do the exact same process, and we'll just be creating a layout like this using pattern paper from your favorite collection and stash. So don't be put off if you're not into it. I have made a plan for you. The sentiments that I used on my layout come from the Holtz Ideology Small Talk sticker booklet. They come in very, very handy for little mistakes like that. Right, so we'll be creating this layout. I'm going to show you how to create all your own pattern papers and then how to put it together. You will also be coloring in your own flowers, so you can customize the page to suit your photographs perfectly. I've titled this page Mischief Makers because this is my very good friend of mine and my daughter at her high tea bridal shower, and you can see these two are up to no good as per usual. Right, so get out all your supplies and let's get making. To create the background for the double page, you will need your two mixed media sheets of paper at 12 by 12. You need a background kind of stencil. You need your water brush. You need a blending tool with replacement foam. This is to put the ink through the stencil. You need some water, clean water, and then you need a light and a medium color for the background. So for my light color I'm using antique linen, and for the medium color I'm using frayed burlap. Okay, I have both the oxide and the inks here. I just like the way they work together. Then you will also need a piece of acetate or transparency, whichever you have. You can use some packaging from Stamp, anything like that. So we are going to create a background similar to this. This is going to be on my left side, and I now need to recreate this to be on the right. Okay. So something I always suggest you check is that your paper actually lines up, because sometimes one side is longer than the other. You can see, even though it says 30 by 30, if I put this down at the bottom here, oops, can't see. If I line it up at the bottom, like that, you can see that it's about a mil shorter at the top. But if I put it this way, line it up at the bottom and at the top, it's perfect. So I always suggest that you just double check that your papers are actually the same size. Right, so we're going to start with a clean piece of mixed media paper. Mine's got a little bit dirty, but that's fine. You will need your mixed media paper. you need your piece of acetate, and we will start with the light colored inks. To begin with, I'm going to squish some antique linen distress ink onto my acetate. I'm going to use my brush to pick up some water and add water to get this to move. So quite a bit of, you can spray, but I find if you spray the acetate, the ink sometimes splatters everywhere. So, and I can control how much water I'm putting on with the brush. You'll then pick up the acetate, and in this section here, we're just going to apply ink to paper. You can see I'm taking the acetate and rolling it to get the ink on. And I'm going in different directions and picking up where it's making little blobs, picking that up and just moving it around to get that first layer of ink onto my page. It's a nice light color. There we go. And we'll dry that. Then you will use a paper towel or a cloth to wipe off any excess ink that remains on your piece of acetate. And we are now going to do the same thing. We're going to add, you can either add another layer of distress, or you can go and add in some oxide. So I'm going with antique linen oxide. I've squished some ink on my acetate. I'm going to pick up some water and add it to my acetate and mix the colors up. So this effect is very similar to the wrinkle-free distress or your smooshing effect, where you run your paper through. I'm going to give you an example of that. Through the inks. I find that this kissing technique with a piece of acetate helps control how much ink and where the ink gets placed much better than if I just put everything onto all the colors down and then picked it up from there. So once it's on like that, you can now spray on a little bit of water to break up some of those ink blobs, and we can give that a dry. Right, so now that it's nice and dry, we're going to add the next color, and I'm going to add the frayed burlap oxide. I'm going to get quite a bit of that onto my piece of acetate, and I'm going to add quite a lot of water. There's a lot of ink here. We have a large area to cover. So you want to get this, you want the ink to get activated. You activate the ink by adding water. Right. You can pick up your piece of acetate and you can see how the ink is moving around. I think we need a little bit more water. There we go. We can get that ink moving. Do you see how it's moving on the acetate? Okay. So we can add some drips. So we get ink onto the paper like that. And then we can set about adding ink exactly the way we did. So I like to go from using it this way. I will turn it and use it that way. And you can just keep adding ink. If you find that you need it to move, use your hand, your fingers to move the ink. Don't rub with your nail. You will get you'll see, I think I'm going to cover it up here. You will actually see the lines in your artwork. And they don't go away. So from experience, I've learned to put it down and use the side of my thumb or use my fingers to smoosh the ink around. Now, frayed burlap is a very interesting color because it separates and gives greens and blues and browns. It's really awesome. So you can see that it's kind of staying in the middle here. I can easily add water to the piece of acetate and we can go and add, do you see, a little bit more ink by just adding it. We don't need to add more ink to the acetate. We can just add water and then get some really awesome effects. So practice this, learn to manipulate the ink and drag it around where you want it to be. And then what's really nice, you see these little spotted bits of ink. They're so awesome to just add little extras to your page here and there. Right. So here where it's pooling and it doesn't really look as effective as I'd like to do it, you can just go in and either use a paper towel or I use a nappy, a toweling nappy, and pick up any excess water like that. And we can go in and dry that. And you see what I mean about frayed burlap, the awesomeness of frayed burlap. Look how that bluey grey comes through, and there's some green and some reddish brown. It's a really awesome color. So these little bits that are left, I know that I'm going to have space at the top there, so I'm going to go in and just add a few splatters to the top and a few splatters down the bottom here, like that. We can even add a few extra splatters here and there. Okay, then I'm going to take my frayed burlap, just clean this, my frayed burlap distress ink. I'm going to add that to my mat. I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. And I'm going to use those as splatters to add a few extra splatters to my page. I'm adding the splatters after I have dried the ink, not before. If these splatters land in the wet ink, they're just going to wick out. So we'll give that a dry. Next step is to add our stenciling. I'm going to add the stenciling with the frayed burlap oxide. I'm going to pop it against my glass media mat, and I'm going to use the stencil. I'm going to use the stencil to add some stenciling down the side here. I'm not going to use the stencil as an entire block. So it is always better to ink sort of from the middle out to where you want it to be. If you start from the edges, sometimes you start too close to the edge. So because I don't want it to be like a formal pattern where I'm going to cover the whole entire, I just want to use bits and pieces of it. I generally will start by loading up your blending tool with a good amount of ink. Hold the stencil in place. Start from the middle and work your way out. And try not to do a solid image. Okay, I lift this, do you see? It's here and there, higgledy-piggledy. Then we're going to move the stencil, we're going to line the pattern up. Let's see if we can get it lined up nicely. There we go. I've got it lined up. Now I'm just going to ink this way. I have not loaded more ink on my blending tool. There is enough ink. So it's just this section that I'm adding a little bit of ink to. Okay? Still a bit speckly. No solid, and you can see how it fades out on the edges. I'm going to line it up again. Let's see if I can get it. There we go. A little bit more ink because I am running out, and I'm just going to go this way. So just this little section. There we go, higgledy-piggledy. And we're going to do that one more time to bring it this way. Just got to get the stencil lined up, get the pattern right. Almost. There we go. One or two, and now I'm just going to do this section here. And what I'll do is I'll work a little bit darker and lighter out to the edges so that it blends. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'd like a little bit more across the top here, so I'm just going to line the stencil up again. There we go. I need more stencil. I'm not going to load more on. It's dark over here. I'd like to just have like a faded out part of the stencil, the pattern going this way. And there you go. So it's very soft and faded. Okay, it does look a little bit solid here, so to fix that, I'm going to take my pattern over. There we go. And I'll go over the previous stenciling as well, just to get it a bit darker. And by doing that, I get it to look like it's the different shades. It doesn't look as solid as what it did. Okay. So that is our background, our base page done. Let's get the water out the way. Right, with our inks on the side there. And that's going to form the basis of our page. Remember, this one's had time to dry. This one is still drying. As it dries, it will lighten up a little bit. Okay, so that is the background. Like I said, I haven't worried about the middle because I know what's coming. I'm working according to the sketch, so I know we're going to put pattern paper here. Right. To create pattern paper 1, you will need a sheet of mixed media paper, which I've cut down to 28 centimeters high, and it's 30.5 across. You'll need a stencil, again a nice background kind of stencil. A stamp, again something that is not specific. I've opted for a script stamp. You will need your inks. I've gone with a light, a medium, a dark, and a very dark. So antique linen, vintage photo, walnut stain, ground espresso. I will be using ground espresso for stamping only. Okay, and you will need your piece of acetate again. So we'll put these aside. They're just here on the edge so that my acetate can go down here. You'll also need some water and obviously a brush to add water to your project. Okay, so we're going to start by adding some antique linen to the background. We're going to do it exactly the same way as we did with the first one, creating our background page. So our foundation color is going to be antique linen. I'm going to add water. Okay, and then this time I'm just going to mist the back of my paper so that we're basically doing wet on wet. And I'm going to apply some of the antique linen here and there. And you can use the acetate to move it around to get that first layer of color on. Remember, you don't want to add, if you're going to add more color to your acetate, remove the water. You do not want to dip your ink pad into water. We're going to add it. Just activate that water and add that another layer of antique linen. So first up is the very light, your light layer goes on first, like that. Okay. Give it some, just give it a quick dry. It doesn't need to be bone dry, just a little bit. You can blot off any excess water. Just wanted the paper to be damp. Right, the next color we're going to add is your medium color, which I've chosen vintage photo, and I've chosen to work with the oxides for this particular layer. We're going to add water to the, get this going nicely. We're going to break up the ink, add water. And again, the ink should be moving on your acetate. Right. We are going to just cover the background with some vintage photo. What I like about the acetate is that it puts ink on here and there, which helps give you that unplanned, faded kind of look with your inks. Right. Clean off any excess water. We're just going to add another layer quickly. Right. This time I've got quite a bit of ink on, and I'm going to add just a little bit less water. I would like the color to be quite intense and not spread out as much as it has with now. But without drying it, I'm going to add, like on the edges here, a little bit darker spots. As you see, by adding a little bit less water, we get the color to be a little bit more intense. And the best part about this is that you can concentrate on an area until it is exactly the color that you want. Remember to add, to get the intensity of the color going, to add layer on layer. Each layer needs to be dry. So to add a little bit of color intensity to this, we need to dry the layer. We can blot off any excess water. And again, it doesn't have to be bone dry. I'm going to use what's on here to clean off on my background. I like that. Clean that off, and we're going to go in with another layer of vintage photo. So you can see one color, the different intensities that we can get just by how much water and how much ink and how much you dry the paper we can get. Okay, I want some ink right in the middle there. And I can use the acetate to my advantage just by the way that I buckle and move the ink on the paper. Now if you've gessoed your paper, you're just going to have to add extra layers and dry more often in between the layers, because gesso does cause for the inks to react slightly differently. They do go a little bit lighter, and it does take a little bit longer to get color onto the background. I'm quite happy with the way that's turned out. Right. Blot off any excess and we can dry. While it's drying, I'm just going to put a little bit of ink on here, still with a vintage photo. I'm going to get this mixed up. Remember, turn it over. When you turn it over, you can see exactly where the wet spots are. If you lift it, the air flows through and it will dry much quicker. There you go. So this ink that I've mixed up over here, I'm just going to flicker on. The closer, the smaller the drops, the further away, the finer and the more area you cover. Okay, close here, do you see? High up, everywhere. So this is how you manage to get into a specific area, cover great ground. Right, let that dry. Little ink splatters everywhere. Okay, you are going to need a blending tool and a replacement foam. I already have a brown one for this. Let's get this dry. You can see where it's still very wet at the back here. Helps you to aim where you need to put the heat to get it to dry quickly. There you go. It's still slightly damp, it's not 100% dry, and as it dries the color is going to change slightly. Okay, and because I don't want it so white, I would like for there to be more color. By applying ink like this, I can now use my ink blending tool and my ink pad, and starting off the page and holding the blending tool at an angle, I can then bring ink onto the page like that. And I can just ink over the entire, just a very light layer of vintage photo, so that I can just dull down the very, very white spots that have been left. And the benefit of having a layer of ink on first before you start to add with the blending tool is that it doesn't leave the blending tool marks. It gives a nice smooth blend. There you go, I'm happy with that. Right, so the last step for this, I lied, there's 2 steps. So the second last step for this one is we will need our dark color, which in this case is going to be walnut stain, and your stencil. And remember, the orientation of the paper on the pattern on your background is this way, so the 30.5 is this way and the 28 is that way. If you're unsure, you can leave your paper at 30 by 30 to work on. So this time we're going to add, it's like a flowery stencil. I'm going to add it. Again, I'm going to start from the middle and work out, and I'm just going to add here and there. So I'm going to put my ink pad against my mat. I'm going to load up my blending tool and work from the middle, work out to add some stenciling. So I'm inking through the stencil. I tend to put it down and turn it rather than rub it across. I think you can hear that it catches. So it also depends on what type of stencil it is. This one has a lot of sharp little corners, so it's going to make more sense for me to put it down and squish it in. I don't mind if my sponge gets a little bit messed up. So here and there, rub it. You also want to leave little areas open, so like very vague. I will check it before I take it off to see if I'm happy. Back again. My brush, my sponge, I can feel is taking a little bit of strain, so I'll swap over to this brush. It is easier through a stencil like this. can just hear the ink goes through a whole lot easier. Let me see. There we go. Nice. So I'm going to put it down, see if I can match up that flower with one of the other flowers, more or less. I'll turn it over. No. It's kind of that one, kind of that leaf, and just bring I find with this brush that you have to put on a few extra layers. You need to take your time with the stenciling. There we go. I'm going to add a little bit here. I'm not too worried that it doesn't line up exactly. I'm doing this next one is going on very light, so that there's just a hint of ink there, and this one too we'll just do a little very light, and then down the bottom here again we'll try to get it on just in this section a bit dark again. Just so that it balances out with that piece at the top left. There we go, and we'll put a light layer of ink just with what's left on the stencil through over here. And that's how you'll build up your, we can put a little bit here, build up the background with stenciling. So again, you're just going to use light and dark to create depth, a depth perception on your layout. And I can see that maybe this one, if I can find its bloom, can be a little bit darker here. Let's see. There we go. You see? So it looks like the light ones are in the back, even though we put them on last, and the darker ones are coming out to the front. Perfect. So once you've done that, the next step now is to add a little bit of stamping. Like I said, I'm going to use the ground espresso distress oxide to add some stamping. So we're going to load up some ink on my stamp. Let's check that it's the right way around. Nope. See, I would have made a boob. Right. Now you saw when I stamped, I got very crisp edges, and that's not the effect that I'm going for. So add your ink and then take a paper towel and just take some ink off the edges, and then I'll show you. You don't get such a, you see how it fades a little bit. We can even take more ink off. So let's load up the stamp, use the paper towel and take some more ink off and start stamping. So I'm going to cover the entire background with a very light, you can see how nice and light it comes out. Where it runs over the darker, it shows up a little bit darker. I'm going to hold it up to the camera now so that you can see. Hope you can see it. Right. So it gives that very light, faded kind of effect. It's very subtle, It's very in the background there. It's not in your face, because remember, this is a background piece that is going to offset your photographs. There we go. Again. Very, very light. And then just this little section, so I'll just ink up half of the stamp, smooth it out, and stamp. Last time. And stamp. There we go. So if you have a look at that, see if it'll focus. Very light, very effective, and just brings everything together. So that is your next, your pattern paper. Oh, upside down. I've stamped it upside down here and there. Nope. This way. It's correct. So this will be your pattern paper number 1. Okay. This will be cutting up to fit the page. So we'll put that aside so they can carry on drying. Next, you'll need your 30 by 30 mixed media sheet, and you're just going to cut it in 15. You need 2 sheets at 15 by 30.5, and we are going to be making the next pattern paper number 2. So for the next pattern paper, I'm going to show you the smooshing. We can work on here, it's fine. Right, so what we're going to do, we're still working with the oxides and our distressing. So we're going to put a little bit of, I doubt you're going to see it, but I'm putting some antique linen distress ink. I'm putting some antique linen oxide. To that I'm adding a little bit of vintage photo here and there, right? And we are going to wet that. And I'll use my brush. You can use your brush or your fingers to break the ink up. If I would just rinse it off before you go to the oxides, before you go to the watercolor. And there we go. We can actually get them to pull into each other. Right. Mist your paper, your mixed media paper, and we are just going to put this in to get that first layer of ink on. Just move it around. And yeah. Again, remember, don't rub your nail through, always just your hand or the side of your thumb. There we go. And dry that. Right, so we've got that so that it's dry-ish, not 100% dry, but dry enough. Right, so we need our acetate back, and this time we're going to add a little bit of walnut stain. So I'm going to add first walnut stain using just normal distress ink. We're going to add some water to that. We're going to keep adding ink using the kissing combination of the kissing technique and the wrinkle-free distress, which is what we just did by adding all the ink to the mat and then adding it in that way. Right, remember to clean off the acetate before you use it. Yeah, so we've added some walnut stain distress ink. We're going to add some walnut stain oxide. We'll do it the same way. We're just going to add water to the oxide, get it to become water reactive. Remember, you want your ink moving on your acetate. You don't want it to be too dry, but you also don't want it to be too wet. Right, so I've managed to put some of the ink over here. I would like to add the oxide over here. So I'm going to get it to move around. Oops. And then add a few drips. Just going to clean this up, otherwise I'm going to get it all over me. Right. And then use the acetate to move that color around. There we go. And this time I would very much like to try and cover as much of the white as I possibly can to get almost a solid coverage of ink. Right. Clean off your acetate. And I'm going to add walnut stain distress ink. I think it's a little bit dry. And wet that. And add more ink. Right. We can dry this. Right, so this is reasonably dry. And again, because I want certain areas to be a little bit darker than others, I'm going to go in and add distress ink directly to the paper using my blending tool. Here and there. And you'll see where we go over the colors that are already there, it just deepens everything. There we go. Right, so once that's done, I'm going to take my brush and just tap on some water. Make some water splats. If you don't want to use your brush, you can use your mister. You can mist on some water like that. But I want to get quite a few spots going, and I'm just going to give it time to do its thing while it's doing that. Right, you can see where it's starting to wick, and I can use this then to lift color here and there. So the longer you leave it, the more a drop, I'll leave that one so you can see, the more it will wick out, the bigger the little water droplets will be. Okay, there we go. So we'll just give that one last dry. And then I'm going to take my walnut stain. I just want to get a tool for it. I want my walnut stain oxide, and I'm going to go around the edges slightly so that I can get it nice and dark, and bring the oxide over slightly to get light and dark areas before I stamp. And I'm not going to do it everywhere, just here and there. There we go. Okay, so it's a little bit darker. I'm a bit happier with the color intensity. There's that. So we are going back to this stamp. Because we are creating pattern paper to go on a layout, what you want to do when you design your patterns is you want something to pull through from one to the other. So my background is completely different, but the colors will pull through to here. In this pattern paper, we've used a stencil and a stamp. So on this one, even though the colors are similar, they are a little bit darker. We are going to use the stamp again, because that then ties it in, it complements the pattern paper one. But instead of it being a subtle stamp like that one, we're going to make it a more definite stamp. And we're going to use an archival. I'm going to use ground espresso. I'm going to use the same stamp. I just want to get, okay, that's just one. Just remember to wipe the oxide off of your stamp before you add your archival. Doesn't have to be 100%, but just get most of it off. Okay, we're going to add stamp on the archival. Show you. Okay, so you see it is much darker and much clearer, and this time I want it to be a definite. I want to cover the whole piece of pattern that we've made with the journal stamp. Nice, clear, precise, definite stamping. Okay, now we're going to repeat the stamp down the side here. And there we go. So we have pattern paper, we have our background created. I'll fetch it quickly. So you have your background. We have pattern paper number 1. Just go this way. And we have pattern paper number 2, which is going to go next to pattern paper number 1, like that. So they are a little bit different, but they tie in. And what ties this one to this one is that stamping. This one in the background, that's very light, and here it's definite. So they obviously complement each other. This one ties in because the colors all work, and that's the benefit of a monochromatic background. Right, for pattern paper number 3, you are going to need another stencil. I'm going to use this one. You are going to need your ground espresso re-inker. you are going to need the piece of acetate and your water. So for this one, I really just want, because I wanted something that's going to pop, not blend in or be the same as the others. I want a strong contrast color. All I did was put some ground espresso on my piece of acetate, and I'm just going to add water. And because I have a big area to cover, we need to add quite a bit of water. You can spray on the, so if you see, I'm aiming my water away from the ink because otherwise it just goes everywhere. The color is going to be very intense, so don't get frightened. It's going to be like almost black. It does dry a little bit lighter, but I wanted something striking and something that will offset but also tie my two backgrounds that I've created, my two pattern papers together. So here we just spray water on. Okay, and then use that water to carry the ink through. And I don't need it to cover solid. The white areas play in my favor because, as you can see, as I move the acetate, I'm able to bring the ink that's laying here. I can pick it up because my acetate is wet. I can pick my ink up here and bring it over here, helping me to get the different shades without doing too much work. It's amazing what water can do in art. So you can see I've got a nice pool of water here. If you bend this like this and move it, you can see there's ink on there, and I can bring it there. So I pick my ink up. See, I've got ink on, and move it over there. There we go. Any areas that are left open, we can just add with a blending tool and the ink pad. There we go. Put that aside. And we can dry this. So for the next part of the process, we are going to add some ink. Let's see. We are going to add some ground espresso, distress oxide. We already have the distress ink on, so we can add a little bit of the oxide just to dull down the very white areas. And it helps with shading, gives us those light and dark areas. You will notice that I haven't dried the background 100%. It's still slightly damp. If I turn it over, you can sort of see that it is still damp in areas. Okay. Right, next up, we need that very nice frayed burlap distress oxide again. Right. So we need our newly created pattern paper, and we need this very nice stencil and frayed burlap distress oxide. You will see how nicely this reacts on here. And because the ink in the back is still slightly damp, it is going to react with this oxide to create a really awesome effect. So again, I want to just cover the entire piece with some stenciling. Because this piece of paper that goes on my onto the layout is what ties everything together. I'm using a totally, like a more specific stamp instead of a background kind of stamp. something that has, like the wording, it's more specific and less vague than the background stamps and stencils. So I've got quite a bit of the ink on. I'm going to lift and just look at that. Isn't that awesome? Frayed burlap. If there's one color you need to own in your stamps, in your ink set, it needs to be frayed burlap. It always surprises me. And you'll see as the stenciling area settles on the ground, on the walnut smooth ground espresso background, the distress ink, and because it's slightly damp, this is the oxide on top is reacting with the water at the bottom, because I haven't left it to dry 100%, but it's not sopping wet either, it's damp. So test things and see how they work out for you. There you go, look at that. Can you see how this is reacting with the water underneath? And just get all this ink on and then we'll chat. Okay, look at that. Look how awesome that has turned out. I added quite a bit of ink here. I did a little bit lighter here and I added a little bit more ink here, and you will see as it dries how it carries on reacting with the water underneath. So I'm going to dry this section that we stenciled first and get it nice and dry. And give the other sections a little bit more time to dry with, to react with the water underneath. Okay, you can see how nice that's going to turn out. So who would have thought, brown on brown? And you will notice that the frayed burlap has like almost like a bluish tinge to it, laying on top of the ground espresso distress ink. And there we go. So there are our pattern papers for this. Our pattern paper 2, our pattern paper 3, and here is pattern paper 1. Let's get the stamping the right way around. So that's going to lay on top of that, and this is what's going to tie everything. I can do it like that together, and the background is going to create a very nice landing page that is going to offset all of this beautifully.